Thanks for being here today. We're really looking forward to share our findings with you. Encourage you all to read the report, but also recognize got asked to write about resource adequacy, my favorite topic. So it's 86 pages. So we thought this might be a great opportunity to share our findings in a more digestible way and also take any questions so that we can help share the findings with the public. The topic of today is specifically we're going to look at resource adequacy benefits of offshore wind, specifically in the United States. Um, I'm a consultant at Charles River Associates. We're an economics consulting shop that works on really high stakes problems across the country and across the world in a number of offerings. Specifically, I work in our energy practice, where we have deep expertise in resource planning all across the country, where we help utilities figure out what types of generating resources make sense for them. And that's the lens through which we performed this work. To give just a high level overview with what we found, there are some real reliability risks, specifically resource adequacy risks across the country. We've seen rapid load growth, which has outstripped the net additions of accredited capacities. We've also seen that across the country. The grid is looking really different, and risks are shifting increasingly to winter from historical periods of summer stress. Given the way the grid mix is evolving, offshore wind has some very interesting characteristics that make it well suited to solve some of the emerging challenges. Particularly, it has some good properties of a very strong generation on these key periods of stress, and also an ability to be built in regions where it's otherwise difficult to build onshore infrastructure. And also it can augment wider grid investments, particularly lots of good synergies with the natural gas system. We also found that while offshore wind is increasingly competitive on a levelized cost of energy basis, it doesn't perform as well as some of the other renewables. However, as we dug into this metric, we had some concerns of how it missed the full story of the role that all resources play, including offshore wind, specifically the contributions to resource adequacy. And we also found that the first megawatt of offshore wind is the most powerful, and this impact is going to decline over time. So we have some findings of, as policymakers and grid planners look at the potential role of offshore wind, they look to find that sweet spot of the right level if they choose to invest. Overall, our finding is no one technology is alone enough or the right, and there's lots of different ways to get to a reliable grid. Offshore wind, though, does have some interesting benefits that could potentially make it a good resource for grid planners to consider as they look to solve some of these emerging problems. When we get into exactly why we're seeing some of these challenges across the grid, we found three kind of key factors. The first is that electricity demand is growing quite rapidly at paces that we haven't seen in decades. And specifically, this is being driven by some of these new industries that are also critical to some of the strategic positioning of the United States. So really the name of the game and kind of top of mind is data centers. We're also seeing other factors like onshoring of manufacturing, as well as electrification of heating and transit. And this is also driving more load growth during the winter months. As we're trying to reliably and affordably accommodate this load growth, people all across the space are taking great action and really working hard, but it is placing stress on some of our existing systems. So namely, our existing infrastructure is under stress. The supply chains with which we're using to bring these new resources are under stress, and it's very challenging to get new resources onto the grid, given some of the complexities of permitting and interconnection processes. When we look at the impact of some of these challenges, they are material. They have real world consequences. So currently, we're seeing that capacity prices, which is the market with which sends a forward signal to help solve reliability challenges and rewards generators for helping to solve these challenges, they're spiking across the country. So this is telling us that that supply demand is getting quite tight across the country. And we've also seen increased occurrence of weather-driven events. So over an 11-year period, we saw 5 incidents of very cold weather outages that either jeopardized the grid or caused outages, and 2 that were of particular note and got a lot of news coverage that we've learned a lot from were winter storms Elliott and Uri. I do want to highlight that there's been some fantastic learnings across the industry, and in more recent winter weather events, the grid has performed much better. But this did highlight that this is a durable concern that grid planners need to think about, specifically this idea of a common cause failure. So if you have a wide area weather event that causes challenges to generators across the whole grid, we need to jointly be able to prepare for that. If we look at the potential that offshore wind could jump in to help solve these problems, we found 4 kind of key themes that emerged to us. First, offshore wind does have relatively strong performance year-round, but specifically, the key is that its periods of greatest generation are increasingly aligned with the periods of greatest stress in the grid. So on the East Coast, this is looking at the winter, and in the West Coast, that's still staying in the summer. And that happens to be when offshore wind is in fact its strongest. And on the East Coast, wind often blows the hardest on those really cold days, which is a really nice synergy. The second synergy we found is that it has some ability to be built in areas where it's very hard to otherwise build things onshore. And some of those areas are periods that are having very high load growth. So the one that stands out is Virginia, which is having very high load growth from data centers. Not quite, you can still build some onshore resources there, but there is some benefit to potentially going offshore. The other 2 that stand out are New England and New York, where you've got high urban population, so it's very difficult to build resources onshore. By going offshore, you can bypass some of those challenges. And the other 2 that stood out to us is the ability to bring fuel diversity to help hedge against some of these common cause outages that we've learned from in some of these recent grid stress events. Because offshore wind is fuel-free and draws on an entirely different fuel source, the wind, than our existing resources, it can help diversify the generation types that we're getting in the grid and hedge against if we have a blip. To illustrate this benefit, we compared, okay, what's the offshore wind generation at a given time of the year? So specifically in New England, how would that perform compared to a peer onshore wind type? And then what if we considered a theoretical natural gas generator and included that the natural gas generator could possibly be more likely to have an unplanned outage during a very cold weather period? So if we look at our graphic, the blue here represents the offshore wind resource, the green is the onshore wind resource, and the red is our natural gas availability. We find some really nice synergies that offshore wind and onshore wind are both stronger during those periods of stress or natural gas. Whereas in the summer, when we see a bit of a lull in wind on the East Coast, that's where natural gas is very strong. So these 2 resources together have this diversity of characteristics and fuel that make them stronger together. The last thing we highlighted was that there's a substantial amount of resources in the queue nationally, so around 80 gigawatts. We recognize that all of these resources can't be brought onto the grid in the near term, but many projects are in advanced stages of construction and development, making this a quite interesting resource to bring on to the short term to help meet some of the near-term load growth and buy time for the wider investments in the grid and infrastructure supply chains to stabilize, so we can meet the moment of this near-term load growth and then bring other resources on in the longer term to continue to maintain reliability. If we dig into these topics further, so first, to dig into what is resource adequacy. This is one element of grid reliability, but it's a really important one. It looks at making sure there's enough and the right kind of electricity generation so the grid can withstand theoretically all the types of events that it would see. So if we look at, okay, what does a grid need to be able to handle to keep the lights on 24/7, 365. So it has to be handled if you had an unexpected generator outage or allow generators to take outages to do maintenance. It needs to handle that weather can be variable year to year, causing the load to look different, as well as the renewable generation to look different. It needs to be with able to stand like extreme weather events as well as multi-day events. So some of the winter storms thinking of that we need to be able to have a hard grid or to have a long duration heat wave. And it also needs to be able to withstand a common cause outage. So if the whole grid was under stress, if you had a blip on a fuel supply of a given resource, can the grid handle it? If the grid is ever in a period of time where it doesn't have sufficient generating capacity in a given hour, operators will perform load shedding, which means intentionally disconnecting the grid to maintain stability. Nobody wants to do this. It can have serious outcomes on public health, as well as the economics of the country, but they recognize they have to do it to help maintain the longer term reliability of the grid. Historically, resource adequacy was relatively straightforward. Grid planners could make sure, okay, I know when my peak load is, it's in a small number of hours, I know it with a relative degree of certainty, and I'll just include a little bit of fat on my generators to help accommodate if my load forecast was slightly off or if I have a unexpected outage of a generator. However, this has become increasingly complex, and grid planners are thinking through new ways of managing risks as they evolve. Some of the challenges that they're having to face to maintain resource adequacy is specifically that load is growing, and also load looks really different now than it did in the past. So top of mind, dominating the news is the data centers driven by the AI boom. This has been recognized by a variety of regulators across both state and federal levels as a key industry, as a driver of economic growth, as well as having strategic importance for the geopolitical position of the United States. And it's also a uniquely energy intensive industry. So historically, a single factory could bring on the order of tens to 100 megawatts of new load, versus a new data center can now be in the order of gigawatts. So this is quite a sea change in the level of load growth that we're seeing on the grid. However, this isn't the only thing driving load. We're also seeing onshoring of other critical manufacturing sectors. So for example, semiconductors really stand out, quite an energy intensive industry. And also we're seeing electrification of legacy manufacturing sites due to either cost-cutting efforts to court customers or investors, or to achieve internal decarbonization goals. All of these types of loads are what we call high load factor loads, which means that they want energy at a relatively steady pace, and it puts pressure on the grid over a wider number of hours, because 24/7, I want this amount of power, so now I need that much power all the time. The second big factor we're seeing in the country is that there's been quite a bit in continuing to grow electrification of transit and heating, some of which is driven by state policy objectives, but also driven by consumer preference. This is really changing when we have load and putting more and more load in winter months. So this is, as a result of these factors, we have more demand for electricity, and the hour at which we're having demand looks quite different than it did in the past. When we put all these factors together, we're seeing some emerging material challenges for maintaining the reliability of the grid due to load growth, changing dynamics of load, and the changing dynamics of the resources we have in the grid. So load growth is just placing more pressure on our existing resources, and higher load growth in the winter is putting more pressure specifically in winter months. So some systems are projected to go to what we call a winter peaking system, but many systems across the country, their peak demand might still stay in the summer, but their key periods of stress are occurring in the winter. So we call this summer peaking, but winter constrained. We're also seeing that the types of resources that exist in the grid just look quite different than what we've had in the past. And this is resulting in a greater spread of risk across a wider number of outages, and also has increased exposure to some of these common cause outages that we really saw and began to understand in winter storms Uri and Elliott. And the pace of load growth is placing strain on our ability to keep up, both with interconnecting enough resources as well as the supply chains to bring these new resources onto the grid. Across the energy space, people are really working hard to meet the moment and developing new approaches and reforms so that we can get enough new resources on the grid and as well understand some of the challenges facing us. One of these new methods that's becoming widely used by planners across the country is what we call an ELCC, or effective load carrying capability. This is a really technical concept, really talked about among energy wonk circles, but it's got pretty serious implications. It's a measure of how much a resource can be counted on to meet some of these periods of greatest grid stress. And it's got some important implications. First, we're no longer talking about just that peak hour of demand. We're increasingly thinking about the grid as a whole and thinking more about, okay, when is stress happening, not just when is demand happening. Second, people are looking at lots of different ways to compute these metrics. So it can be somewhat complex when looking at a number. Are these apples and oranges, and can I compare them? So it's always important to keep in mind and look under the hood. What is the ELCC method that people are using? What does it mean? And ultimately, it's going to be a 0 to 1 number that's going to measure what portion of this resource can I count on during those key periods of grid stress, and how could this change in the future? When we look at what an ELCC does, it's really capturing that contribution towards grid reliability, and there's different ways to do it. Not going to go into the details of the exact approaches, but just highlight every market does it a little bit differently. So you can't just say New York ISO says this, PJM says that. What's going on? Really, the right approach is to look at how a given resource does compared to other technologies within that same market. The other really important thing to keep in mind is that an ELCC for a resource changes over time as the grid mix evolves. So kind of the classic example that we have on our mind is how solar performs. So we've done this study where we've looked at the ELCC contribution of a solar resource, and we find that it's quite variable season by season, which makes sense because the generation profile of solar is quite variable season by season, and it declines over time. And this occurs because the resource is able to shift those periods of key grid stress kind of as a victim of its own success to a period of time where the generation is not as strong. So keeping these in mind, we've got all these factors in our mind as we start to evaluate the ELCC of offshore wind. So we're thinking through, okay, how is it contributing to key periods of grid stress, and how will it evolve over time as penetration grows? The next thing we also wanted to look at was how are legacy resources playing their role in helping to meet some of this growth. So we looked at the most popular resources that are being brought onto the grid and starting to level set on what role they're playing and what are some of the challenges that they're facing. So first, onshore wind, somewhat similar to offshore, has in much of the US great generation during the winter, which is reflected in modestly strong ELCC values. However, the challenge there is that many of the best places for onshore wind are in the middle of the country, so far from these key areas of coastal load growth, as well as requiring substantial land to build onshore wind resources. Second, solar is increasingly the most cost-effective resource and is the leading resource in many interconnection queues across the country. However, because of its characteristic shape, its ELCC has become quite low, the lowest in all markets across the country. Storage also really strong, good ELCCs because it is a dispatchable resource. However, it's a net energy consumer and needs other resources to generate the energy to charge, particularly during longer duration winter type events. And then most critically, natural gas as the backbone of the existing grid and going to be the backbone of the grid in the future. However, it's facing some challenges specifically on just the sheer amount of load growth, which is placing pressure on the supply chains and the existing fuel infrastructure in some parts of the United States, especially New England and New York, whereas other regions have abundant headroom and can add natural gas resources. Lastly, we also looked at some of these other type generators. So coal, next generation nuclear, or geothermal, recognizing that many of these are going to be really strong contributors to reliability, but coal is unlikely to be brought onto the grid as a new resource, except for potentially uprate of existing resources. And next generation nuclear and geothermal likely are not going to be ready in time to meet some of this near-term load growth. We wanted to dig into these further, especially looking at the natural gas system, given its criticality to meeting load growth. So first, we looked at, is there headroom, especially in some of these key regions in the Northeast, to add new natural gas? And we looked at historical demand as well as using our internal gas model and found there's very limited headroom to add new natural gas resources with a firm contract, especially in the winter months. So possibly you could add a new resource, but it would be on an interruptible fuel contract, meaning that as demand for natural gas got tight, you potentially couldn't count on that resource during a key period of grid stress. And this aligns with other findings and warnings by regulators across the country that the existing infrastructure in New England is under quite a bit of stress. We recognize that there's been some investments to bring new pipelines in the region, which will help ease some of these constraints, but similar concern of whether or not that will materialize in time to help support some of the near-term load growth. The other factor we looked into is we spoke to 5 major natural gas engineering, procurement, and construction companies to help understand what are they doing to meet the moment and what are some of the challenges they face. And they emphasized to us that they are really working hard to bring new generation onto the system, but pointed out some key challenges that are raising some concerns for them on their ability to keep up with the pace of load growth, and specifically pointed at supply chains are quite constrained and that some of the major manufacturers are currently being utilized at 90% of their manufacturing capacity, that the permitting process can be quite complex, and the interconnection process can be quite complex, leading to multi-year delays, and that they're also seeing increased competition for getting skilled labor to bring some of these projects online. So all of these putting together kind of what we've learned about the existing resource adequacy outlook in the grids across the country is there are material concerns. Load growth has outpaced the net addition of new generating capacity, and this is resulting in material risks, especially in the winter months. We're also highlighting that this risk looks different than it looked in the past, and it's increasingly about grid stress, not just peak load, and it's increasingly spread over a wider number of hours, especially in the winter months. And we also found that legacy generators are going to be critical to meeting the moment, but they're also under stress, in particular highlighting natural gas as a critical resource to maintain reliability, but facing material challenges to keep up with the pace of load growth that we're seeing in the country. When we dug into the potential cost context, recognizing that affordability is also a critical element of maintaining a responsible electricity grid, we looked at various cost measures through which we could evaluate the role of offshore wind. And first, we looked at levelized cost of energy, which is one of the most popular and intuitive metrics that captures very simply, okay, dollars per megawatt, how much does this resource cost? However, we had some concerns about this metric because it sometimes excludes transmission costs, recognizing that that's a critical aspect to accurately understand what's the cost of offshore wind going to be compared to other resources. And it also misses system interactions and this capacity value. So even as we're in this really critical resource adequacy moment, levelized cost of energy isn't always going to capture how much a resource can could contribute to that key aspect that we're seeing in the grid. To help deal with that challenge, we used another very simplified metric called normalized levelized cost of energy, where what we did is we just simply normalized our levelized cost of energy using an ELCC. So we're trying to get at both day-to-day on an energy level, how cost effective is this resource and how much can it contribute to resource adequacy. So this is starting to get at some of those bigger picture concerns. However, recognize still a simplified metric and still only missing some of those system interactions. Ideally, where we want to go and where we're going to go in future work is more thinking about grids holistically and thinking about the whole grid together. So looking at more an integrated resource planning approach, which will look at this is a portfolio as a whole, this is how technologies talk to each other, and really help us understand potentially, okay, this is how offshore wind can perform, and this is how it would perform relative to credible alternatives. So look for future work from us, looking more at that space. When we look at the numbers, so using Lazard's levelized cost of energy, where a lower number is better, increasing a more cost-effective resource, we find that consistently solar and other types of renewables are the most cost-effective. Offshore wind has improved recently in its LCOE, but it is typically more costly than other renewables, while competitive with many thermal resources. However, simply doing this sort of normalized levelized cost of energy look, where a higher number indicates better performance, so more affordable and also a high ELC resource, the story looks quite different. Where we see some of the best resources are more of those combined cycle resource, both the wind onshore and offshore wind stand out here, as well as coal. And this raised some concerns for us, just that you're getting quite different orderings, even with a simple metric, highlights that perhaps levelized cost of energy isn't capturing the whole story of what we're getting from a different benefit. So certainly something we're going to dig into in the future. Lastly, diving into deep dive in markets across the country, we looked at PJM, New York ISO, ISO New England, CAISO, ERCOT, as well as looked at international lessons to look in Northern Europe, where offshore wind is already a mature technology. And the top three really stood out to us. I'll dig into each of these markets in depth in a moment, but these seem to be markets where offshore wind is best positioned to play a material role. CAISO and ERCOT certainly are seeing some resource adequacy challenges emerge due to their evolving grid mix, as well as substantial load growth in ERCOT. But the offshore wind industry isn't as mature in those markets and doesn't have quite the same bang for their buck as some of these other markets. Certainly could play a role in the future, but not quite as strong as the top three. When we also looked internationally, we found that offshore wind is playing a material role already in Europe, specifically helped mitigate some of the geopolitical shocks that we saw due to the recent Russia-Ukraine war, which had significant disruptions in the natural gas fuel supply. It also has some great lessons on what happens to the ELCC of offshore wind as it becomes very mature. So the UK publishes a study on the ELCC of various technologies and has seen that as offshore wind has reached quite high penetration, its ELCC starts to decline as it increasingly shifts the periods of greatest grid stress away from strong wind hours. So this is certainly something that grid planners should keep in mind and finding that right level of investment if they're looking at offshore wind as a resource, or looking at ways to pair offshore wind with other types of technologies, potentially even long duration energy storage, so that you're finding that system-wide balance to get to resource adequacy. Delving into these key markets further, the first one that really stood out to us is PJM. PJM is home to many of the highest data center markets in the country. Northern Virginia, obviously standing out as the leading data center market in the world, as well as seeing substantial growth in other parts of the market. PJM has also had retirements of quite a bit, 47 gigawatts of mostly dispatchable resources due to age, economics, and some policy goals. And its queue is primarily composed of solar and storage resources, and it has had slower interconnection than it would like. Taken a lot of efforts to improve that recently, but certainly something that has been a factor. All of this together is PJM's load growth is growing quite substantially, faster than most markets in the country, and it's had evolution in how it does this capacity accreditation. So its ELCCs for resources are changing. As a result, the capacity prices in PJM have spiked quite substantially recently. So we saw a 9x increase between 2024 and 2025, and a further 1.2x growth in the most recent auction. And this is raising material concerns for the resource adequacy of the grid. In particular, sort of two regions that have really stood out, Maryland and Virginia, raised as particular concerns in the recent DOE study, recognizing that study had was somewhat controversial. So taking those assumptions, exact results with a grain of salt, but recognizing that gives us good information of where we're seeing risk in the market. If we dig into the accreditations that are assigned to the different technologies in PJM, we can look at these last two auctions. Offshore wind has quite a competitive ELCC. It leads among all renewables and outstrips both a CT that's not dual fuel, as well as 4-hour, 6-hour, and 8-hour storage. And both onshore and offshore wind's accreditation increased by about 15% between the two auction cycles. What this means is that PJM is increasingly saying, hey, we want resources that are good in the winter. That's when we're seeing stress. Wind is a great resource to do that. This is what we're asking for in the market construct. The other potential benefit that we're seeing for offshore wind is that it could be directly linked to those key regions, Dominion and BGE. We'll highlight the level of load growth in PJM is likely to materially outstrip the ability of offshore wind alone to solve, but it does appear to be quite well positioned to augment wider investment and helping to meet the moment in some of this substantial load growth that we're seeing in the region. If we flip to ISO New England, the thing that stood out to us was some of the stress on their existing fuel system. A number of utilities and regulators, including NERC and Northeast Power Coordinating Council, have all highlighted this as a material risk to the region. It's currently dependent on LNG imports as well as trucking to get fuel to where it needs to go. So this is something certainly of concern. If that ability to import fuel was ever disrupted, it would have material impacts, particularly during the winter months. We're also seeing that load growth is quite concentrated in the winter months due to electrification of heating, as well as this is a tale of two systems here where you have concentrated urban pockets near the coast and then more rural areas. And this creates challenges of building new resources where much of the best onshore renewable potential is far from these coastal regions near Boston. So it creates some challenges of importing that energy into the coastal regions. We also highlight that there's some policy uncertainty. So this has created some challenges of bringing all new resources, including offshore wind, given some of the delays we saw of the Revolution Wind project. When we look at the potential role of offshore wind in ISO New England, they've done some great studies that looked at what the ELCC of technologies would be in different technology features. So this can give us some insights into what would the accreditation of given technologies be if different levels of technologies appeared. So the first thing we notice, we have 3 scenarios, scenario 1 and scenario 3, where we have a modest level of investment in offshore wind, only about 1 gigawatt, and scenario 2, where we see a more deep investment, where we're looking at 3.3 gigawatts. So we notice that first gigawatt of investment of offshore wind, the ELCC is very high, around 95%, which is competitive or outstrips all of the resources, with the exception of hydro and onshore wind. And the reason we're seeing such strong performance of onshore wind is likely due to the assumptions of quite low levels of penetration, given the challenges of bringing onshore wind resources in the region. This also gives us great insight into how this resource could evolve over time. So we do see the ELCC decline to about half if it went to that 3.3. So still a material number, still competitive with many other resources, but it starts to go down over time. And we see that energy storage pops up, likely because it's able to benefit from that excess energy generation and recharge. So we're seeing potentially some of the synergies between those two technologies. So these are really important factors for resource planners to keep in mind of thinking through how is this technology going to perform over time, recognizing that that first megawatt is the most powerful. And as the ELCC decline doesn't mean that that first megawatt still wasn't powerful, but just the impact of that next marginal resource starts to decline over time, and thinking through how these technologies talk to each other. And lastly, if we look at New York ISO, which is another region which has very similar dynamics to ISO New England, though slightly less stress on the fuel system and slightly more challenges on some of the urban constraints. So New York ISO is also seeing the majority of its load growth in winter months and is projected to flip to what we call a winter peaking system. It's seen significant stress downstate in key urban regions like New York City and Long Island, and it has retired some of that local peaking generator capacity in those regions, and it's already seeing some transmission congestion. So what's happening is many of the resources outside of these urban pockets, and they're having to import the energy to other regions. Also recognize that due to competition for natural gas fuel during winter months, which is prioritized for heating, many generators in the region are forced to rely on distillate backup fuels, which are more expensive and more environmentally burdensome, but this does allow them to maintain reliability. New York ISO's accreditation is evolving. They're still working through the mechanics of their accreditation process. While ELCCs for offshore wind are still competitive, the market monitor has raised some concerns that their accreditation doesn't fully capture cold weather risks. And we know that New York ISO is working through it and has recognized those challenges. So even as I present these numbers, I do think they're going to change over time and would likely more reflect the numbers that we saw in PJM and ISO New England. So if we look at offshore wind's ELCC, it does outpace equivalent renewables, but it doesn't have the accreditation that we see from a 4-hour storage resource. But this is likely going to change over time as New York ISO evolves in its accreditation. We also want to call out that South Fork is operating in New York ISO and has really shown the role that offshore wind can play in augmenting wider investments. So this was selected to help solve a very constrained load pocket on Long Island that had real challenges bringing in energy because of transmission constraints, and also had fuel constraints, so limited ability to add a new natural gas resource. So in our mind, this is kind of that sweet spot of offshore wind can play, of really helping to solve some of these transmission and gas constraints while helping to harden the wider system. So when we look at what the kind of overall summary of what we found is that offshore wind leads among renewables and is competitive with thermals in some market. This competitiveness is driven by its strong generation during these key periods of grid stress, but recognize that its ELCC is going to decline as it and if it successfully shifts the risk to lower wind periods. Also highlight that it has some interesting siting benefits if it can be piped in directly to some of these key coastal regions where it's difficult to build other resources, or where there's already significant constraints on the existing infrastructure. And we'll highlight again that it has some interesting properties as being able to augment wider investment, potentially ease fuel constraints by these resources working together and filling in for each other during periods where one of them experiences stress. Overall, our findings is that the grid there are material resource adequacy risks and affordability challenges, given some of the aging infrastructure and load growth in the grid. We recognize that policymakers, regulators, and utility professionals are working hard to solve these challenges, and really taking action to meet the moment. We looked through the potential role that offshore wind could help augment some of these challenges. Certainly recognize that there's no one way to resource adequacy, and there are a variety of reasons why a market might choose to pursue different technologies. However, just from that resource adequacy lens, offshore wind has some interesting properties that really help align with these key emerging periods of grid stress, namely winter, in particular regions where transmission or natural gas infrastructure is stressed. So it can help align with those periods of challenges, as well as help work in areas where it's quite hard to build onshore infrastructure. In the future, we want to continue this thinking, and we're working on a paper right now where we do some of this IRP style analysis. So start to think more about the portfolio as a whole, thinking about the interactions between all technologies. And we're specifically going to focus on ISO New England and New York ISO, and look at potentially the role that offshore wind could help with moving beyond just resource adequacy, as well as looking at some of the affordability challenges that are also facing our grid. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions.
Thanks, Oliver. It looks like we have two questions. I'll start with the first question we received in order here. Can you share more about the geographic grid regions and data sources that we shared behind the chart on slide 8, showing the relative gas and wind capacity availability factors throughout the year?
Yeah, sure. This was produced by us and some of our internal modeling. However, much of the underlying assumptions are public. Got the underlying data from NREL's wind toolkit, as well as these are public assumptions based on cold weather outages. Certainly recognize that the exact performance of a wind generator is going to be highly dependent on the site as well as the actual wind turbine, and that the performance of a gas generator also dependent site to site, dependent on if they have hardening. But yeah, if you reach out by email, happy to share some of those sources if you're curious yourself.
Sounds good. Okay, the next question we received here is, did we proceed with the assumption that natural gas will be the backbone of the grid in the future? Given the proliferation of cleaner energy resources that are handling peak loads, will this be the case? For instance, California has shed 2/3 of its grid's natural components.
Yeah, I think it's a fair
Natural
question.
gas.
Yeah, it's a fair question, and it's certainly a part of the conversation. We recognize that as well, that many grids are looking at even further decarbonization in the future, especially as some of these dispatchable technologies like long duration energy storage, geothermal, and nuclear are commercial. So certainly appreciate that is possible and even likely in some markets in the country. However, my personal view in the near term, depending on the country, having some type of dispatchable resource will be critical. In the near term, that certainly is natural gas in my view, but recognizing medium term, longer term, there's real potential that dispatchable resource looks like something else.
Thanks, Oliver. Okay, we have another question regarding ISO New England ELCC values. Is that something CRA calculated or based on the preliminary numbers ISO New England published last year as part of its capacity accreditation reform effort?
Yep, the ELCCs here are based on the ISOs themselves. So we've just pulled these straight from the ISOs. In future work, we'll look more, do our own modeling to look at the actual resource adequacy benefits of different technologies.
Okay, and then is there, there's a quick follow-up on that, that there's an understanding that ISO New England is updating and redoing that analysis that they have?
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's a great question. And honestly, a real challenge for grid planners is that ELCCs across the country are quite variable and change over time as market rules change, as the resource mix change. I think PJM's results here kind of hit the nail on the head. That even between two capacity auctions, their accreditation went up 15% for offshore wind. So that's something we are constantly keeping in mind in this work of not only taking the numbers at face value, but thinking through why did that resource get a good accreditation. So recommend that for others as well, is that ELCCs change, they will change, and it is one of the challenges of the moment we're in.
Understood. Yep. Next question here is, can you explain the graphics that show how offshore wind participates in balancing the scales, i.e. balancing loads and supply?
On which
Actually do not have it. Oh, this one here. Yep. I guess this is,
okay. Oh boy, we're doing it. This is definitely one of the more challenging parts of resource planning is this ELCC metric. So yeah, appreciate the question and happy to dive into it. So the way this works is we use some very sophisticated models, and as kind of illustrated by some of the other question askers, there's lots of ways to do it, and we're evolving in the way we do this in real time. So where we start with is we start with a model of the market where we say, okay, this is a wide range of outcomes that could happen for load, that could happen for wind, that could happen for solar, and that could happen for outages for other types of generators. And we calibrate that model to get it at an acceptable risk level. Then for the technology that we're interested in, so in this case, wind, we take it out and we're going to see, oh gosh, that resource that was there is now gone. So my reliability is now worse. Then very carefully, I add back in what I call a perfect resource. So unlike wind, which has ups and downs as the weather changes, it's going to be perfectly available all the time. And I'm going to compare, and I'm going to do that until I get exactly back to that base case reliability. Then I'm going to compare the performance, the nameplate capacity of my actual wind resource to that perfect resource. And that's how I get to an ELCC in much of the country. We'll highlight that this metric is great, used by lots of folks, but it's a little non-intuitive and it's computationally complex, especially I have to do this second iteration. So there's been other approaches that folks have looked at, including just counting contribution during key periods of stress, or just looking at the marginal impact of my grid with and without a resource. So certainly evolution in the space, but this ELCC type approach is kind of the go-to metric in the industry.
and the next question we received is with respect to cost studies. I was just looking up the link that was provided here to us regarding, NREL having conducted studies indicating that LCOE does not tell the full story about offshore wind costs. And instead of using ELCC, they use levelized revenue of energy. Why did we not choose to use LROE and not ELCC? If you want to start with this, Oliver, I can also take a crack at answering that as well.
Yeah. Yeah, certainly agree that there's other metrics and really appreciate the highlight of great work here. Also fully agree that there are costs that are sometimes excluded in LCOE, specifically transmission, which can be included, and certainly something important to think about with all of them. So that was kind of issue number one. Second, we had less emphasis on cost in this paper because we're thinking about it more in future papers. And then last, I think we're perhaps talking about just different metrics. ELCC here just being kind of a simple normalized metric to normalize the LCOE. So not saying that this is a alternative or better than the study you referenced by NREL. So just taking a little bit of a simplified approach. And Dean, you want to add any color in there?
Sure. I mean, when we look at the LROE, it's looking at the projected revenue of a resource divided by its production, which is the benefit that the resource will produce over time. And I think there's an adjustment for the PPA price in there as well. And that's based on a snapshot or a forward look of what the market values are. When we're looking at more of the reliability metric, we're really solving for the reliability issue and not necessarily making, part of it, there is the economics case as well. But one of the key charts that we showed is that as we add capacity of a particular type of renewable resource, the ELCC does go down. So there is a declining curve of benefit over time because the production's correlated and the relative benefit on a reliability from a reliability perspective does decline as you add more and more megawatts of that resource. And there are inflection points, and one of them that we found was the 1 gigawatt figure that we had. So LROE might not capture that sort of dynamic. It's also just a cost comparator. We really need to move towards integrated resource planning as we add more and more resources. We're solving for how a portfolio comes together and has potential synergies to optimize the cost for the entire system together. Okay, I think there's a few more questions here. How did you factor in transmission constraints across the different markets you analyzed? For example, certain regions of the PJM market, the coastal area of New Jersey, lack the transmission infrastructure for offshore wind to come online quickly.
Yeah. Yeah, appreciate the question. So sort of two transmission problems. One, transmission to get the offshore wind, and two, the transmission to deliver onshore resources. Looking more deeply at that in our future work here, just more kind of theoretical, looking at the potential contributions in that ELCC sense, but certainly in the future that's on our mind, specifically some of the transmission congestion. If we're looking at places like New York, onshore transmission into New Jersey also stands out to me, and ISO New England, well reported and something we work on quite a bit in our markets work. So yeah, appreciate that the logistical challenges for some of the transmission upgrades on the coasts are important when we talk about onboarding offshore wind, but also thinking about the transmission congestion that's occurring onshore as well.
Next question here is a bit broad. What do you think, Oliver, what would be the most important takeaway from this analysis in your view?
Every megawatt is a good megawatt. We need investment in new generation. Winter generation is great. I think that's, for me, got to be the priority, and high ELCC generation, my personal view. But really, when we're talking about some of the load growth, especially in places like PJM, every megawatt is a good megawatt. And then if we're looking at some of these key transmission congestion and fuel constrained regions in the Northeast, every local megawatt is a good megawatt. So really a time for investment in the grid across the board. Offshore wind being a potential resource that folks could look at in concert with kind of all technologies being critical to meeting the moment.
Okay, appreciate that, Oliver. We do have we do have several questions regarding whether we'll post the slides. We'll go ahead and do that. So please, we'll circulate that link. And then I think we're at the end here for time. you have any further questions, I think we can certainly follow up in the future. Oliver, hand it back over to you for closing remarks.
Yeah, really appreciate everyone coming today, and really great questions, and excited that electricity grids, resource planning is kind of top of mind, and happy to hear thoughts from you all on kind of ways we can make analysis better, any feedback or sharings, and really happy to share our learnings of kind of what are some of the challenges and potential role that technologies like offshore wind can play in help solving some of these emerging resource adequacy challenges we're seeing in the grid.
All right, thank you all for coming. Bye-bye.